Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande.
Doombase.
The man is seated cross-legged opposite Carissa, in their private time-dilated forbiddance, which no other is to enter during this event. The universe is a bit over 3 meters tall from floor to ceiling, and though the ceiling is something like a glowing blue sky, it is not really the same. The man takes a scroll of heightened extended detect thoughts. The spell at just second level cannot provide enough raw power for him to get enough decodable information off Carissa. He has more scrolls, but they will still have relatively little time. Both of them think quickly now, and at this level of intelligence there should be little wasted motion, but there is much thought for them to exchange. He casts the spell, observes Carissa, permitting it to take hold. He signals Carissa that she can go ahead and put on her artifact headband, combined now with her wishes, and then, when she's ready, cast her own detect thoughts on him.
Carissa is very unsure whether this will work, whether it will be impossible to think in front of Keltham or not, but the worst-case scenario here is that it doesn't work, and they learn nothing. She's decided to not try to make it work, because trying to make herself willing to have thoughts in front of Keltham seems like a terrible idea. If he turns out to feel safe to think around, then this will work, and if not, it won't. All she's here to do is learn which world she's in. She takes her headband back. It's not actually a headband. That's how she thinks of it. Because she's a wizard who spent the first 8 years of her adult life saving for a headband, but it's a crown by any reasonable definition. More elaborate and more expensive than the crowns most kings can arrange to wear. The metal is cool to the touch no matter how long she holds it. Carissa wants to be smarter and better and know more things and have more space to think them in. She puts it on and feels her mind expand around her. She gives herself 10 rounds first to just breathe, take it in, exult in it. She is more complete and more alive, and her delight in that need not be tainted by all the facts that are going to immediately come crashing down on her. Many Carissi Sevar will live their whole lives without being wished and artifact headbanded up as far as magic can take them, without letting their thoughts spool out in a mind that is big enough to contain them. It is not 1 ounce less satisfying and less beautiful and less wondrous than she imagined it. If anything, it's more so, because there is more space in her now for imagination. Right then, enough of that. Time to save the world. There's not an easy solution. It's the first thing she looks for when she puts her headband on. She's been considering it unlikely, really, but likely enough that much of her remaining hope resided there. That there was some clever solution as likely as Keltham's mainline plan to result in the overthrow of hell and the return to better custody of those souls subject to it, which did not run even a small residual risk of destroying everything else in creation. There isn't. Or if there is, it's something that uses Dathilan knowledge alongside Golarian knowledge, something that'll occur to her or Keltham in a blinding flash of insight only when their minds are met and joined. Not something Keltham has seen himself yet, and not something you can infer if you've only built one computer and still can't really see how to convert many of the questions you actually want answered into its strange language. She would think about it longer, but it's unlikely she'll see it in another 60 seconds if she didn't see it in the first 6. Not if she doesn't even see a promising angle of attack. In the absence of the easy solution, there's only the difficult one. In the last week before their trip to the City of Brass, she took to organizing her wall for her future self, circling particularly confusing questions that she hoped smarter Carissa would be able to resolve, trying more to identify important questions than to answer them. Answering them was for later. For once, she was smarter. For now. Well, not quite now. Answering the questions on the wall is the 3rd item on her to-do list. The 2nd is to look inside herself. She hasn't really been using Dathilani cognitive techniques for a while. She used them to talk to Keltham. Otherwise, she'd fail to talk to him entirely. She used the really inescapable bits, the bits about how you should try to believe true things instead of false things, and check yourself internally to see if you're doing that, if your questioning processes are even trying to spot your confusions and rip them away and arrive at the truth. But there's a lot more than that. And for the last month, Carissa has been, mostly deliberately, mostly as the result of an explicit calculation about the merits of this course of action, but only mostly, holding them in abeyance, because she did not trust that they would not change her. She still doesn't entirely trust the techniques, but one of the things that is immediately obvious, from here, from this place of greater clarity about the roiling sea of emotional agony that has been most of her life since she left Osirion, is that she's going to need to be using more of them than she's been using so far, or the world is probably going to end. And while she's changed in some ways from the Carissa Savar who some seconds ago put her headband on, she has not changed in being entirely sure that every other thing she has ever cared about or ever will is worth tossing into the furnace for a 1 in a million chance that it'll save the world. And that is, of course, the first place to look. With her newfound mental fortitude, with a sharper spotlight she can use to catch any lies she might still be telling herself and any places she might be looking away from. Is she, mentally and emotionally, configured in the best possible way to work on this for as long as it takes, alongside Keltham even when everything he says is incredibly frustrating and feels slippery and wrong-headed? No. This is hardly a thought that required lifting her mind up to a new stage where most people could hardly recognize it. She talked about it with Carmen on her second day here, when she first needed a break from making her wall of strategically important questions. She'd picked a coping mechanism by then. She was visualizing her thoughts, in her head, as suspended above a river of torment, red-hot like the Andromal winding through Dis. That way, she could identify when a thought was touched, singed, shaped by the river of agony, and rerun it. This, Carmen had said, was not the approach most people come up with, to trying to think clearly while in pain. Mostly, they try to make the pain less intense, less immediate, until it's the kind of pain you can work alongside as an old friend. Be in constant emotional agony, use very elevated wisdom to check if thoughts were touched by the intense emotional agony, is both not available to most people and not a very good idea. Carissa obediently tried various approaches to being in less emotional agony. She determined that many of them were designed for problems that were not the literal worst possible outcome under your values system is very likely to happen and it's your fault. Since many of them were about noticing and appreciating how the problem you had was not the worst possible problem to have, or not likely to be very bad, or not very likely to happen, or would leave a world worth living in even if it happened. They would be very useful if she were emotionally distressed about her family going to hell or something normal to be sad about like that. Most ways of being in less emotional agony involved looking away from reality, and she could afford that even less than she could afford the emotional agony. Most ways of trying to shape her thoughts to dip into the river of agony less often involved shaping her thoughts to not tell her when the river of agony was influencing her, and that was even worse. So she told Carmen it was the approach where she was in constant emotional agony, but learned how to keep her thoughts properly clear of it, or nothing, at least until she was even wiser. She would be sculpted around the pain she was in, but at least she would see it clearly. Have no thoughts. She couldn't think and know which thoughts to distrust. That was the best solution she could come up with. That was wrong, of course. The thing she can feel herself doing now was possible even at her previous wisdom. She actually thinks that one of the fundamental revelations she's having, one of the general principles here, is that all this was possible for the very original Carissa, the little girl at the world wound worshipping Asmodeus with no magic at all. All she's doing is looking at the pain and knowing that it does not help. That because it does not help, it is a luxury and she cannot afford luxuries. It feels strange at first and counterintuitive for pain to be a luxury, for grief and guilt and horror and misery to be luxuries, but that's what they are. They are parts of Carissa which are real and important and which she cannot afford. The pain does not want to hear that it's a luxury. The pain wants to be necessary. The pain wants the story to go that Carissa Sevar is in so much pain and has to do her work anyway. But of course the story is better, truer to the pain and truer to Carissa Sevar, if it goes that Carissa Sevar does not have the luxury of being in pain. If you do this wrong, you'll just fold the pain up on itself and be miserable about your own misery, count it against yourself as another failing. Here, she does feel like she's using a skill she didn't have before, a skill that she certainly at least never used before. The skill of reaching for each thread of her mind and knowing how much pressure to put on it so that it dissolves instead of hiding. It feels vaguely like picking blackberries. You develop a sense of which are ripe on the vine and ready to fall into your hand. She looks at the pain, thread by thread, and she tells it regretfully that she cannot afford it. That precisely because the thing that she is mourning is so important, there is no space and no time to mourn it, and so she'll have to not be in pain, and that too is part of the tragedy, that she must walk into it without even the comfort of being permitted to grieve it. She does it very gently, very cautiously, so she doesn't just hide her thoughts from herself by accident. After a while, in the place of the red-hot river of agony, there is an abiding conviction that it would be correct to mourn, correct to scream, correct to pound her fists against the floor until she broke every bone in her hands, but that she cannot, because the world deserves an advocate who is not distracted. It deserves that more than it deserves to be mourned, even though it does deserve to be mourned. Carissa Sivar is strong enough to build her 40-foot wall of strategically important questions while at every instant suffering intensely, but she actually needs to be stronger than that, strong enough to stop it with the suffering intensely, so she's going to do that now. That's not the whole of it, but it's a solid few steps closer. She looks at Keltham then, and casts Detect Thoughts. Of course the spell behaves like that. How did she never notice before that there's an obvious better configuration? Every spell is going to be like that? Have little unnecessary points of tension no one could see how to unfurl. She could fix them all. And then looks up to meet his eyes. She doesn't feel afraid. That wouldn't help. She does feel curious because that's the kind of thing that might.
His mind lays open to her, as it did in the beginning, 4 months and 1,000 years earlier, when she cast a lesser form of this spell on Keltham shortly after his arrival in Galarion. Now she is 5th Circle and INT 29, and he is greatly changed and she is greatly changed. The structures of his mind unfold before her in vastly greater detail. They are more orderly now than when Keltham arrived in Galarion. Stronger, sadder, and better organized. His mind shows, because he had been watching Carissa confront her dilemmas just now, his thoughts about how he handled those matters himself. He did not switch off his own hurt. Past Keltham never tried to switch off his own hurt at any point. Pharasma might have seen that as self-modification, planning to extort her, creating a new version of Keltham that would feel less hurt over having to annihilate everyone in Pharasma's creation. His thoughts swiftly glide over the reasoning there, trusting to the augmented powers of thought detection that he sees in Carissa now, the swiftness of her thought, to understand what should be instantly comprehensible at INT 29.
A coherent being almost never modifies their own utility function. To choose to hurt less about destroying creation is to be readier to destroy creation, to choose that under a wider range of circumstances. So a coherent agent in past Keltham's place, even having already mostly decided to destroy creation, would not modify its utility function to assign less negative valence to destroying creation. What about the small probabilities of creation not being as it appears, in which case you might have to change your mind in the future? Even if on the most probable main line you expect to carry out the same decision after modifying your utility function and get the same amount of utility according to your current utility function, there are possible worlds where the different utility functions imply a different choice. Those possible worlds do not have zero probability. The different decisions you would make in them represent an expected loss from the standpoint of your present utility function. And so a coherent mind almost never self-modifies in that way. The expected loss is obvious. What would they gain? A coherent agent never has cause to bind itself, to war within itself. If it would benefit from predictably doing something, it can just predictably do that thing. Past Keltham was not coherent and hurt inside, at the thought of killing everyone he'd met in Galarion. Murdering trillions of innocent people, maybe isekaiing them to some place as unpleasant as Galarion had been to him. Or just their ceasing to be at all, if what happened to him really was a special case. Though there seemed to be strong arguments that it wouldn't be, he did not want to do that. Which is to say, metaphorically, from the quizzical perspective of a more coherent mind, that past Keltham derived internal disutility from the event of his imagining and choosing situations of sufficiently low external utility. To a weird, twisted, mortal, incoherent mind like that, might there not be utility to be gained in choosing to hurt less? If you're going to destroy creation anyways, why hurt about it too? If it's the same outer act, the same outer consequences either way.
But what if original Keltham wouldn't have been able to destroy creation, would have flinched at the end, turned away from the betrayal of deontologies? What if original Keltham furthermore would have turned out to believe deep down that Pharasma would yield to Alter Keltham, hence that Alter Keltham wouldn't need to actually follow through if he'd made himself hurt less about destroying creation? And, even if that's mostly not what was going on, what if Pharasma's decision theory, looking at something as much of an incredibly incoherent mess as past Keltham, saw elements in it of Keltham maybe flinching away, of his fearing he might flinch away, his expecting Pharasma to yield? When he made the decision to exert what power and wisdom he held over himself, to make himself hurt less, and so become readier to destroy the world. So, just in case, he didn't do anything that Pharasma might interpret as making himself hurt less about the prospect of destroying the world when he realized that was what he needed to do. He didn't deliberately or wantonly think about the painful thing all the time, as would have been stupid. He also didn't stupidly not think about that area of thought space. He went on thinking about alternatives to destroying the universe. He didn't deliberately think painful thoughts, but he left those emotions in place, ready to fire unchanged, when at the end he made his last decision to proceed with his plan, knowing that it might end with him destroying everything. On a moral level, what he's doing has simply the moral meaning of him destroying creation. If Pharasma or Caden Kailean comes along and makes something else happen instead, that's not to his own credit, and he needed to not think about all that anyways. He didn't actively think about how much he didn't want to destroy creation and isekai everyone in Axis, didn't actively call that pain down on himself. He also didn't try to do anything about the sickening sense of sadness and despair that went on in the background anyways. That might have been a forbidden self-modification and increased the actual risk to creation. That person wove himself a new structure, woven out of the pieces that past Keltham shattered into. When past Keltham met a situation that set his inner pieces at odds against each other, consequences and deontology and virtues no longer in accord and pointing in separate and incompatible directions. That man decided not to fall apart, to stay sane anyways, to continue anyways, which was also a capability that Dath Ilan had tried to grant him. He didn't do it perfectly. You're supposed to have help from a keeper, to put yourself together again in a way that makes sense when you take enough damage that you'd fall apart if not for your decision not to. Sanity by fiat is meant to be a temporary thing, for emergencies. The person that Carissa met when she came to the Doom base from Osirion, he conceived of himself as something of a mausoleum to past Keltham's last wishes, made out of the pieces of Keltham. All of his remaining self-care was concentrated into his last hope that the world wasn't really real, that the people in hell weren't really there, that the main consciousnesses in this continuum, with a lot of reality fluid underlying them, were himself and Carissa and his other potential love interests and maybe a few other people. In that case, he ought to not sacrifice himself fully for the sake of destroying hell or mending Pharasma's creation. But he couldn't actually do that, it turned out, couldn't balance creation and himself. He didn't have enough reflectivity during his temporary bouts of Wisdom 20 to make changes that could simultaneously optimize around himself and creation. Especially not when those self-modifications also had to work at Wisdom 16, when the Owl's wisdoms wore off. A mortal cannot always divide their efforts between two possibilities, not in practice. He had to choose between optimizing for his own inner life and optimizing for creation, and he chose creation, because he wasn't that selfish in the end. The only hope he'd held out for himself was that a last plea of his had been heard, that the quality of a viewpoint character had left him. He'd tried to conduct himself accordingly, be something that could fade into the background of the plot. Hoping that something far above had heard him, listened to his last plea, and removed most of the reality fluid from his computation, letting the real Keltham continue somewhere else, from just before he cast Fox's cunning on himself back in Osirion. Even finding himself still in Golarion, he could still hope for that most of himself wasn't really there anymore. He thought about his own existence as little as possible, a poor man's substitute for daring to try to interrupt the reflective thought loops that underlay his own consciousness.
For a long time, Carissa did not understand what Keltham meant when he claimed that he wasn't Keltham, that Keltham was gone. She isn't confused now, even if Keltham appears to, on an impressively comprehensive level, not care about the things Carissa personally gets out of existence and care about a completely different set of things that don't matter to her at all. She wishes he had been more selfish, too selfish to destroy the world, selfish enough to grasp for the less likely story where they fix hell some less risky way. There's no point dwelling on that either.
When he reached Intelligence 25, Wisdom 26, Splendor 25, after receiving Carissa's wishes and Pilar's headband, he put himself back together, though that's more a question of his using Wisdom 26, now 27, to operate all his pieces individually, rather than him trying to make there really be a coherent person inside. There are obvious better ways to grow up, as he saw later with some time to think. One such obvious way involves increasing Thinkumph more gradually, having new experiences that fill in your slightly larger mind with new motivations, new philosophies of thought and action, newly learned intuitive choices, to become a real person and not just a utility function hooked up to Thinkumph. All of that works better with a passion driving you towards something you actually want, and not just a lesser horror you're steering at to avoid a greater one. It works better if your life and love and startup isn't in ruins, if you have something positive to look forward to. Carissa could become a coherent person like that, maybe, if she doesn't have to become a god instead. She's not happy, but she's driven and unified within herself. He could decide to make himself become that regardless, at Wisdom 27, envision a plausible person he might have become if he'd done things the slow, correct way, then imitate his best guesses for what a person like that would think. But then there's the question of whether that would constitute a self-modification too far away from the original Keltham's original reasons for choosing to destroy the world. He is very constrained now in how he dares repair himself. Small risks matter when they're on that scale, and also he can't achieve real organic happiness anyways, so it's not worth it. His mind is all deliberate structure now. He doesn't just exist and feel, he is working to a plan of what to think and feel. Deliberate strategies of internal choice. If he were to describe himself now, it would be that he is something inspired by Keltham, a crafted artwork designed in the shape of past Keltham. But he's not in pain anymore. He's ready to feel Keltham's pain later, when it might matter to how Pharasma perceives the decision theory of threats versus best alternatives to negotiated agreement. But for now, he's just not in pain. He's decided not to think those thoughts in the native structure that would bind to the circuits firing those emotions. That's something you can just do, at Wisdom 27, if you have all of Dathilan's knowledge and training that it gave to the tiny childlike past Keltham about how minds work. He'll think those thoughts again in their native format at the end, when he makes his last mortal decision, and imprints himself onto the form of a god. Just in case what's currently on his mind has anything to do with what sort of god he becomes when he touches the Starstone, that he doesn't want to kill everyone, that he'll do it anyways, and not hurt any less about it, if that's what it takes to end Pharasma's creation in its present form.
She wishes Keltham could have gone on being the person that he was. She liked the person that he was. She understands now why he couldn't just be the person that he was, but smarter, the way she can be the person that she was, but smarter. She thinks about what she did anyway, in case it helps him. But she suspects that it won't. The core thing about Carissa Seaver, which has been true since she was 4 and first realized it, is that she is the person with a direct and immediate interest in the survival of Carissa Seaver. That gives her an intimacy with all possible versions of herself that she could never feel for any other person, that no other person could possibly feel for her. Every Carissa Seaver, whether created through memory modification or enhancement or curses or whatever else, possesses a stake in Carissa Seaver's continued survival that no one else in the universe possibly can. When tiny 4-year-old Carissa was scared because she'd gotten in trouble at school for misunderstanding an instruction and gotten beaten, she could take comfort in the love and support of grown-up Carissa, of Devil Carissa, the future people who want Carissa to live because they can only live through her. The next most core thing about Carissa Seaver is that she loves being alive. Some of that was interwoven with Asmodean things she's now discarded. gratitude to her creators that she is not sure is entirely coherent, since their decision process about whether to make her did not involve a check about whether she'd approve of being made or about whether she'd be grateful. She does think she approves of being grateful to any creator who created her, conditional on her gratitude, of serving any creator who created her, conditional on her service. Asmodeus's mistake is that he didn't negotiate for her loyalty. More fool he. But most of the wonderful, perfect delight of being alive is just a fundamental truth that felt as real when she was 4 as it does now. That to take in input from the world around her and make sense of it as much as she can is a wonderful, glorious, untouchably perfect thing. And as she's grown bigger, she can take in more input and make more sense of it and answer and ask newer, more complicated questions, and it's wonderful. The next more core thing about Carissa Sevar is that she wants the world to not feature any big, appalling problems that might eat her, so that she can study magic all day. This, too, has persisted uncomplicatedly in her self-concept not since she was 4, since she was 11, maybe. If it's possible for her to solve the big, appalling problems, she'll do that, because it's what she'd want someone else to do. But the point of solving the horrible problems is to get to study magic all the time. And from there's a lot of branches, bits she's exploring, like why it's what she'd want someone else to do features so much in her reasoning, and whether that's enough to get you all the way to good, or if it's more of a lawful, neutral thing at its core, and why she likes being a cult leader, and why she thinks Despotter and Abigail were good for her in ways good versions of them wouldn't and couldn't have been. But all of them feel like whether or not they persist across any particular set of new capacities, she'll remain herself and recognize herself and love herself and be happy for herself that she gets to be alive. She is sorry if Keltham isn't shaped in such a way that he can take any advantage of any of that. It's probably not high priority to resolve, but she wishes it were better for him.
He is showing all this to Carissa. Now, showing her all of this, all of the Dath Ilani technique he can, because he is pretending that snack service does not exist, and if snack service did not exist, he would be desperate to find a better way. Even more desperate, would be giving Carissa every advantage he can, all of his art, all of his knowledge. Because maybe she's the story's protagonist, and she can think of a way out, a way to save creation without maybe destroying it, without releasing Rovagug and killing everyone in Project Lawful and Osirion, everyone he knows in Galarion. He has seen Carissa augmented in the City of Brass, for it opened his thoughts to her, for it will trust her, for it would give her any resource in his power, for it. If she can think of a better way to rescue all the souls in evil afterlives and make Pharasma's creation something that doesn't hammer down any civilization before it forms, he'd do that even if he was taking snack service into account, just in case. If she needed him to true suicide for it, he would, only not go to hell, for that is something he'd never do. He is not that unselfish.
Carissa isn't actually going to use the Dath Ilani techniques for this. She'll look at them, learn from them, and then build something else for herself. She isn't sure Keltham understands the way she feels about Dath Ilan, about Dath Ilani mental techniques. She suspects that she wouldn't have ended up needing to do so much translating of the things he says to her if he understood. Carissa thinks that Dath Ilan is a nice place to live for the people who live there, and probably doing notably better than any institution she'd know how to run at acting on the values of the people who run it. And it makes sense that Keltham misses it very much. She does not actually share much in the way of values with Dath Ilan. She's thought about it because it might be very important, and she has picked out the parts of herself that were just rationalizations so she could endure Cheliax and pass mind reading. And even once you strip all that away, Carissa thinks that getting to exist is very important, that ceasing to be is far worse than going to hell, that if you are annihilated from 1 billion universes and someone makes a copy of you in a different universe, you have lost almost everything that mattered, that average utilitarianism does not describe her values or anything that even resembles them, and in fact feels like a silly value function someone made up to win philosophy arguments, not a plausible account of how a person's deep wants for the world could possibly be shaped. She is aware that it is a real way people's deep wants for the world could be shaped, but certainly not hers. There aren't Carissae in Dath Ilan. And she wonders whether there's no one born like her or if they just get shaped some other way in the course of growing. Dath Ilan is not really something she wants to see win. Dath Ilan winning isn't very good by her values. She suspects it's wrong by Carissa's values to kill demons and magical beasts and wild turkeys and mules. It's definitely wrong to kill anyone who can object. She thinks it's definitely wrong not to make new people if you can do it. It's all right to hurt people if you're good at it. It's all right to have slaves if you made them or saved them when no one else would have. That's what a Carisaish good would look like, she thinks. She isn't herself Carisaish good, but if she met a civilization of it, she'd want to see them win. Dath Ilan's mental techniques were, in a very ordinary sense, engineered to make people Dath Ilani, engineered to raise Ilani children who share the fundamental assumptions of their society. Every society does that. There's no way of raising children without inculcating them in your values, nor would it be a reasonable thing to try. You can tell them about the importance of independence and thinking for themselves, but that's a value of your society that you are inculcating in them. There's nothing wrong with it. Since Carissa disagrees with Dath Ilan on almost every important values question relevant to her life, she is wary of building her mind out of cognitive techniques meant to produce Dath Ilani. Even without assuming any malicious engineering by Dath Ilan's technique engineers to confuse people about their own values, Dath Ilanism teaches ways of resolving some of the muddles inside people, and Carissa thinks it mostly does not resolve them in the way that a fully worked-out Severism would resolve them. If she had time, then Carissa would discard Ilani techniques entirely and build it all herself from scratch. She didn't initially agree with this premise of Ira-right philosophy, but it has grown on her. The best cognitive techniques for you are the ones you hammered out yourself. At your pace, with your goals as an aim, with access to some examples. But without a model you'll get stuck on and use as a base for forming your own. Of course, she doesn't have time. She needs to become as skilled as possible as quickly as possible, even if this means building a permanently worse and diminished Carissa because of using techniques that aren't hers, that are designed by people that don't share her values, and that resolve all her muddles in the wrong way. It's better to have access to those tools than to not, wherever she's not able to invent her own fast enough. But she thinks that the version of her built out of Ilani techniques, instead of out of her own techniques she invented herself for her own specific values and purposes, will be substantially worse. And so she's trying skill by skill to calculate the best trade-off and then use the Ilani technique, or not, depending how that calculation comes out. And of course, it is not a good use of her energy to feel sad about this, or bitter or resentful, so she's not going to, but she considers learning Dath Ilani techniques to be replacing bits of her own soul with aliens with alien priorities, and it is the sort of thing that would grieve her if she had time to grieve. She doesn't share Keltham's sense that people ought to enhance themselves slowly, bit by bit, filling out the pieces of themselves as they grow. It seems like one thing people could do, but not the only one. But she does feel that for mental technique building, that it's actually something you ought to do at your own pace. All of this to say that she's listening, trying to take in everything Keltham is trying to push at her, but with wariness, because the tools he's trying to teach her to use are tools meant for different goals than she has.
Rolling your own cognitive techniques is an obvious goal. Dath Ilan has a whole philosophy about it, that knowledge isn't truly part of you until you could reinvent it from scratch. He supposes she could try to run off only the Ira-right version of that philosophy if she's worried about contamination, but it sure is a very Dath Ilani way to look at the world and yourself. If you consciously understand the ways you shape people, but letting them become themselves is one of your goals, it follows that roll your own cognitive techniques is something that your civilization would try to teach people to do if they could. It's why they don't have Galarian-style schools full of memorization, why they herd children into discovering for themselves how Dath Ilan orbits its own sun, the simplified equations of classical illusion gravity. Dath Ilan engineers people to be themselves, to discover themselves, to a degree far beyond anything that anyone in Golarion has ever considered doing, because they have the luxury of that in their optimized world. to figure out the precise conditions to let children discover gravity for themselves and not make them memorize it. And children aren't told either, until they suspect it, that the simplified equations of classical illusion gravity they discover aren't the final truth. Maybe Carissa at INT-29, cognitively overpowered in some ways if not others beyond anybody who existed in Dathilan, using mutual telepathy with INT-29 Keltham, can reinvent her own cognitive techniques to any significant degree within a week or two of time dilation. It would not particularly be possible otherwise. Past Keltham was not taught very much of the art directly. He was too young to need it and too stupid to use it, but he was taught a lot of the material that can be used to invent it at INT-29. Here, then, is some of what she'd need to know to rebuild her own version of the art from scratch. Even at INT-29, the detect thoughts are not fine enough that she'll be able to pick it up from watching him think at this speed. But it is something of an overview of what she could try to learn later at speed, using INT-29 and telepathy.
And his mind reviews some of it for her. What little he was taught of the vast amount that true civilization knows about cognitive science, and some of what he filled in at INT-29 around improved recollections. Like a zoom-out video showing Dath Elan surrounded by its entire universe, only with meaningful content with implications in every piece of it, stars that are structured words instead of tiny dots of light in an illusion. Macroanatomy and microanatomy of the brain, over 100 cortical regions in 2 hemispheres and subsurface structures. Vision here, spatial sense here. One kind of sensory integration and motor planning here. The mapping of the body's homunculus onto it. But that sensoromotor cortex interfaces with the cerebellum, which does this kind of motor planning. Microanatomy, the layers of the cortex, the different neurons making up the layers, how they mesh with each other, the signaling mesh produced by temporal synchronization of 2 already synchronized cortical columns that recruit a third equidistant member. This is a cerebellar chip, detecting errors and correlating those errors against 100,000 inputs. A branching factor higher than exists anywhere else in the brain, yet still vastly reduced in dimension compared to all the incoming sensory data. Differences between expected reward and actual reward. The equations for how much an error in either direction updates the neuron. If the errors can't be gotten down to 0, the neuron equilibrates, metastable if not stable, around the point where the error nudges in both directions balance in their sum. Circuits in subcortical structures that watch the larger world model, binding emotions to them if they recognize the format. Here's what civilization taught him about the way that those circuits wire up in childhood, the lesser ways they rewire in adulthood. The gene expression cascades underneath, the locally simple learning equations they implement, local gradient descent, temporal difference learning, fire together, wire together. This is what a human brain really is deep down, the real character of cognition as carried out inside mortals. And his thoughts start to zoom back upward from there, through the levels of organization in intelligence, pointing out particular emotions and the subcortical structures they correspond to, what those emotions take as successes and errors, how mortal habits train themselves and balance around the point where subcortical error nudges counterbalance each other as they propagate through the whole brain. Most of the local parts of cognition are usually in equilibrium, but there's always something being updated somewhere, and so the brain's habits in some are always moving, like a 3-dimensional puzzle piece slotting into place, fitting together the mathematics of decision theory, what he's already taught her of computation and programming to build the magical simulator of magic, calculus, equilibria, expected value, valid inference. Combine it with what civilization knows of the specifics of how brains compute things, and you can see the shape in the center, how that shape matches with all the surrounding areas of knowledge and binds to it, like a protein molecule slotting into its receptor. This is thoughtcraft, much like spellcraft, but with different laws of physics. It's one fragment of science. There's kind of a lot of science. Past Keltham didn't tell her because he didn't know how to teach all that, and definitely not quickly. Not knowing that detect thoughts at this level was possible, and it didn't seem kind to him to say what sort of education adults had that he couldn't realistically pass on in any reasonable time.
How the brain works isn't actually something Carissa had ever particularly wondered about. It wasn't just an unanswered question, but one where it was hard to imagine any answer being particularly useful. There's so much world, so many things to learn, so much detail everywhere. How could anyone know those things and think it'd be better if it were all gone? It's sad, in a way. A very small sadness next to the other ones, but still sad. That he couldn't have told her that when she would have collapsed into his arms in delighted wonder and just wanted to play with the idea all day. She appreciates his telling her now because she can see that he wants her to, because it really is fascinating. She'd have less hesitancy about borrowing from Dath Ilani knowledge of the physical functioning of the brain, except that, of course, wished-up and artifact-headbanded minds probably don't even exactly work like that anymore.
Everything is of a piece because reality is one piece. All divisions between areas of knowledge exist in the map, not in the territory. The perspective that she labeled average utilitarianism relies on an understanding of generalized relativity as it applies to quantum mechanics. This being something past Keltham didn't discuss with Cheliax earlier, because combined with the most elementary math of quantum fields, relativity directly yields an understanding of antimatter, which is the most obvious way to use wishes to destroy countries.
You can, of course, get the equations of relativity just by observing the physical facts, but to really understand them, children are led to guess them in advance by contemplating certain questions and dissolving those questions as ontologically meaningless. How fast is the whole universe moving? Seems unobservable from inside the universe, and you could argue, is not only unobservable but meaningless, because in the simplest conceptual frameworks that do predict what is observable, motion is the motion of particles relative to each other, not motion relative to an absolute space that is unobservable and hence can be eliminated as an element of the theory. But maybe there is an absolute space. Maybe physics has absolute space beneath it, and everything is moving at a speed through that space. Maybe someday you'll discover laws of physics, simplest logical rules that would reproduce a universe embedding you to observe what you observe, that imply distinguished structures that stay motionless within space, mathematical seams that are observable, and measuring those, you'll discover the whole universe is moving at 1 billion kilometers per second, relative to absolute space. How do you know you won't? Later, you're shepherded through discovering the relationship between electricity and magnetism, generalizing the classical illusion field equations for those, and realizing that the wave propagation through that field is light. And this, it seems at first, implies a fixed speed for light, relative to the electrical magnetic field. And you might think, couldn't you measure how fast you were moving relative to light, and so measure how fast you were moving relative to an absolute background space? So the thought experiment about the whole universe moving twice as fast, suggesting that only relative motion is real or even meaningful, has failed to predict the character of physics. There was an absolute space after all, but actually every time you measure the speed of light relative to yourself, you find the same speed. No matter how fast you're going or how fast the light source is moving, you find the same measured speed of light from your own perspective. And when you work out the logic of what that shocking fact implies, it ends up requiring that you view spatial dimensions and time dimensions as being relative to your current velocity. Which is to say, the time distances and space distances that observers at different speeds observe as different quantities are not the underlying elements of reality. The only thing that's still invariant from every perspective is the interval between two events, which in terms of classical illusion measurements would be expressed as the square of distance in time minus the square of distance in space, with the speed of light converting units between the two. This surprising additional math indeed is exactly what's required to implement a universe where there's a universal speed limit reflecting the locality of causality. And yet the only meaningful elements of reality are the positions of things relative to each other. That reality went to this extra effort to make physics visibly relative, in this sense, is the beginning hint of a deeper truth that proves to be more general. Physics is built around a certain spirit and character in which relative positions, not absolute positions, are the elements of reality in the ontology of physics. Over and over, it proves possible to start from a thought experiment like, if I'm inside a sealed room, should I be able to tell if I'm staying still or moving at a constant velocity of 1 million miles per hour? Or, should we be able to tell whether the whole universe is rotating or not, relative to absolute space, by seeing if there's centripetal forces being generated by the rotation? To answer, No. If I can't see the quantity from my own perspective, ultimate physics must be arranged in a way to make that quantity not exist. One can correctly derive intricate laws of physics from that principle. It's idealistic reasoning, but it's a form of idealistic reasoning that reality itself seems to use, the same way that reality seems fond of calculus, or continuous quantities, or numbers and math more generally. You could say it's first principles idealistic reasoning, using the sort of idealistic first principles that reality has been empirically observed to respect, and which prove to cause people to correctly guess physics without observing it first, if they're led to guess using those principles. Gaularian physics, he strongly suspects, is partially an imitation of that simple Dathilani physics, and partially has been artificially constructed and modified and complicated away from that physics, so that this universe can run both mortal biology copied off Dathilan and Dathilan's physics, and also include magic and souls. It can be seen from first principles reasoning, using the kind of first principles that reality has been empirically observed to actually follow, that it shouldn't be sensible to ask, how quickly or slowly are the laws of physics operating, unless there is some larger outer universe establishing a speed metric to be compared to. Similarly, you can't ask, is the universe upside down, unless there is some larger spatial metric that embeds both the universe and something else that points in a direction. Further beneath reality is quantum mechanics, in which the basic quantities are complex numbers, amplitudes, assigned to positional configurations of particles. The integral over the squared absolute values of those amplitudes, the measure, seems to describe how real something is, or rather how relatively real something is, because physics doesn't talk about the absolute amount of reality at that lowest level. Only the relative quantity, relative phase, slope of derivative, of the amplitudes. If you run a quantum experiment that divides the greater reality into two subworlds, with amplitudes over configurations that interact almost purely internally within a world, this happens all the time, to be clear, or at least it did in Dathilan. There's 10 to the large number divergences of worlds every second as entropy increases over time, and Pharasma's creation is either doing the same thing or pretending very hard that it is. And one of those worlds has twice the integral over quantum measure as the other. You'll find yourself in the larger experiment future 2/3 of the time. Do 1,000 of those experiments and look back, and you should find that around 2/3 of the outcomes reflect the larger quantum future. There's a version of you that sees the smaller outcome every time, 1,000 times. But those yous are only 1/3,000 as real, and you'll almost never find yourself there. Only experience yourself seeing that to a very tiny degree. There's no physical difference that would be observable if you doubled all the tiny amounts of realness. And this is also the kind of physical principle that you can correctly guess from thought experiments about relativity. What would it even mean if everything everywhere simultaneously became twice as real? You can get this quality of quantum physics by observing experiments, but you can also advance guess its character via the vastly productive principle of relativistic thought experiments. It's meaningless to imagine all of existence becoming twice as real. So reality is only relative, and that's why physics over amounts of realness only speaks of the relative quantity of those amounts. Some things can be realer than other things. It is meaningless to ask how real they are in an absolute sense. There's a meaning to one person being twice as real as another, inside of larger reality. You're twice as likely to meet people who exist in twice as many places. But what does it feel like from the inside to become twice as real, or half as real, in an absolute sense? Nothing. And in fact, the thought isn't meaningful, just like there are no absolute phases in quantum mechanics, only relative phases of the amplitudes. One future can be more real than another, and you'll mostly experience yourself in the futures that are more real. When you look back in your past, you'll find that the experimental statistics for results roughly match the physics-predicted amplitudes of those results. But when you look at yourself and question how real you are in an absolute sense, imagine yourself becoming twice as real, or half as real. You're imagining something that wouldn't feel like anything, because it doesn't mean anything. Just like it wouldn't mean anything for time in the universe to run twice as fast, unless it could run relative to some larger universe and greater metatime. This, in a sense, is why you find yourself experiencing anything. The answer to the malformed question, why does anything exist at all? It doesn't require anything larger than yourself to give you existence, as would then need some further outer factor to lend existence in infinite regression. Structures of relative realness always find themselves to be as real as themselves, however much more or less they exist compared to other things, and that's why you find yourself inside a physics ultimately comprised of a structure of relative realness. In Darthilan, that physics over relatively real elements was quantum mechanics over amplitudes, but even if it's something else inside Pharasma's creation, it'll ultimately be made out of stuff that embodies relative quantities of existence. Nothing that exists can be absolutely real, as isn't even a meaningful concept, but only relatively real to other things. So whenever you look closely enough at something that exists, you'll find out that it's made out of tiny bits of relative degree of realness.
He is thinking all this because it seems to him entangled, as truths of empirics and validities of reality often are, with what a sensible mind would end up valuing as it shakes out its emotional structures, binding to pieces of reality as the brain models it. It seems to him that you can't actually just say that you reject Dathilan's concept of how to value people's reality. Average utilitarianism, as she calls it, though in Dathilan it does not have a name, and have that be divorced from everything else Dathilan knows. There are pieces of morality that can be pried apart from other elements of a coherent decision system, like whether you enjoy seeing people suffering or enjoy seeing them happy. That's something you can pry apart and invert without affecting other parts. At least if you're talking about an agent with a utility function. It doesn't work that way inside normal mortal humans, obviously. Humans are woven together more tightly than that. But in principle, you could pry away the utility function of something that did have a utility function. Whether your ontology of thought is over relative amounts of existence, or hypothetical absolute quantities of existence as seen against an absolute outside of all reality yardstick of existence quantity units, like imagining an absolute right side up direction of space, isn't something you can pry apart from understanding physics with an ontology that's based around relative positions and relative realness in a very visible way. When you worry about whether it's a crime to make people's sum over futures add up to less than the reality of their current selves, to wonder if this is a crime apart from people objecting to it, apart from whether their remaining futures are pleasant or unpleasant, it seems important to comprehend that becoming less real does not feel like anything from inside, and in fact, doesn't mean anything except relative to other things being more or less real than that. When it comes to asking whether an enslaved being should be grateful to have been created, it matters to his own emotions. Morality philosophy that this being who will be enslaved would counterfactually otherwise still exist somewhere. In fact, would exist within a countably infinite number of such environments, all existing to some tiny finite degree of relative realness, summing to a finite total. What an entity like Asmodeus is doing in creating somebody is changing which environments are more real relative to that person, and changing which futures that person will predominantly experience. And as an entwined effect, making that person more encounterable by others in the same larger environment. If this future and environment is not pleasant, a future of slavery, this seems to him to be not a favor requiring a grateful reciprocal favor, as the act is phrased and described in his own ontology.
Carissa realizes that you cannot reject Dath-Ilan's morality piecemeal because all of the pieces form a worldview together. That is why she stopped using all of it and would, if her concern were for her own integrity, never use any of it to build herself, even the science. None of that information makes her an average utilitarian, as she predicted it wouldn't, when she considered the space of possible observable features of reality Dath-Ilan could have observed, which would have caused them to all be average utilitarians. Carissa took into account how good an explanation Dath-Ilan would probably have for all of its alien values, considered how confident she was that her values were different, and isn't learning anything from being told that, yes, Dath-Ilan has a predictable explanation for its beliefs. She didn't reject them in the conviction that Dath-Ilani hadn't argued the question. If there are an infinitely many Galarians which are functionally identical, such that there are infinitely many Carissae in this exact moment of existence considering this exact problem, then there being half as many isn't a meaningful thing to describe. She recognizes that this isn't quite the frame Keltham is using. She's not sure yet if his frame is importantly different. But it's coherent to care, for instance, about in what share of universes she exists, or in what share of universes in which she existed at some point she exists for a long time, or in what share of universes in which she exists her parents and sister exists, and it's coherent to, if you wake up inside a new universe, have preferences about whether you died and stopped existing in your old one. And if you prefer to exist in as large a share of the universes that there are, and for the duration of your existence in every universe to be as large as possible, and for the people you care about and all people who aren't insane, people who want to die to live in as many universes as possible, and you would be distressed to learn that you are murdered in your sleep half the time you fall asleep, then she's pretty sure you end up not an average utilitarian. She's being snarky. It's much harder not to in her thoughts. So she does want to note that she appreciates Keltham not trying to make the infinities argument to her until she was smart enough to immediately better articulate her preference. If he'd said that to a small Carissa, she might have thought she had to be persuaded because she couldn't describe what she cared about coherently, and she appreciates it about Keltham that he didn't try that.
She's catching up satisfyingly fast now, but even at INT 29 comprehension is apparently not instantaneous. This is a distracting thought and not good protocol to think out loud, and he wishes he had not thought it. This is not an argument from infinities. The ontology of physics is also written in such way as to visibly reject infinities. You never actually meet an infinity, and what do you mean by that word anyways, is among the first principles that reality is empirically observed to favor. If you imagine, probably counter to fact, that Carissae are 1/3 of everything that exists, you could say that there are infinite Carissae, which are 1/3 of an infinite existence, or that there are 0 Carissae, which are 1/3 of 0 existence, or that there are 12 realness units of Carissae, who are 1/3 of a greater reality with 36 realness units. The only real thing in all three cases would be the relative quantity 1/3. The units appear in both numerator and denominator, and cancel out. It's not meaningful to talk about everything becoming half as real. It's not meaningful to talk about Carissa becoming half as real to herself from her own perspective. If reality is as large as Dathilon had strong reason to believe, and encountering Galarian hasn't exactly counter-argued the case, it's not true to talk about some external factor creating a new Carissa whose pattern would otherwise counterfactually not exist anywhere else in reality. It's a meaningful claim, but a false one, always. Reality looks to be quite large, and even a small, large number of universes will be enough to saturate the number of meaningfully distinct Carissae that can exist. There's only so many ways to put together all the atoms making up her body, if you only consider those atoms' momentary positions down to a tolerance of one atomic nucleus's width. It is meaningful to talk about Carissa becoming half as real to her parents as she once was, or her parents becoming half as real to her. He wasn't trying to say otherwise. It's consistent, coherent, for Carissa to care about how her parents here can't see her again, even if she continues somewhere else, and that place also has a copy of her parents. It's coherent for Carissa to want to be in more places, to be more encounterable from the perspective of other people, for lots of people to meet a Carissa one day. The weird to him part is where Carissa seems to feel like her being encountered by more people in greater reality makes her more real from her own perspective somehow, and is a selfish good. From a selfish perspective, Carissa can control the fractions of future universes that she'll encounter, through her decisions. This indeed is what all ordinary decisions do, control the relative realness of the possible futures that continue yourself. She can't make herself be more or less encounterable to herself from her own perspective. She can want to experience being in the same universe for longer, and not get isekai'd to somewhere else. But that's a question of which possible futures containing herself are relatively more real compared to each other, not the percentage of existence she holds within larger reality. On a personal level, he doesn't really want Carissa to update about this, because if she wasn't trying to copy herself over as much of the multiverse as possible and never ever get isekai'd the hard way, she wouldn't really feel like Carissa anymore. He's not even really arguing with her about it. It's just weird. In the sense that it's a long sentence from the standpoint of somebody who thinks about reality using a language with a simple correspondence to reality's native structure. Or in the sense that most human beings who grew up knowing from the start how reality worked probably would not shake out their initially incoherent emotions in a way that attached great selfish importance to a fact that's impossible to measure or experience from inside yourself. The fact of how often you are observed by other observers within a greater reality.
Carissa honestly doesn't distinguish, really, in her head, between selfish goods and unselfish goods. There's just the whole long list of things she wants, some of which she'll notice having gotten and some of which she won't. Her desires about other universes all feel like the same kind of desire. To her, she hopes for each universe that the universe is rich and interesting and populous and has interesting magic and that the people get to do cool things and that one of the people is her. It doesn't feel different than wishing the universe isn't a hell, which she imagines is in Keltham's values.
That Carissa Seaver, the girlfriend he ran into after losing most of his reality fluid inside of Dathilan and ending up somewhere else, desperately wants to be everywhere in reality, even if some of those instantiations are awful, is one of the more probabilistically suspicious facts about this entire situation. It's the sort of thing that would be true if something at a higher, lower level of reality was trying to be ethical about which people it created, or rather lent additional reality fluid. It might pick a kind of person who would totally want to be more instantiated almost anywhere, even in a place as awful as Galarian. He is in fact kind of horrified about this. Relatively far more people will give permission to be instantiated in nice places, meaning those places don't have Carissae because they don't need Carissae in particular. The places that get Carissae, rather than other interesting people, will be places where only Carissae give permission to make them emissaries or recipients of reality, to fix those broken places, where most sane, sensible beings would not feel so grateful for being forcibly volunteered for it. It's not exactly a very pleasant fate to call down on yourself, from his perspective. From Carissa's perspective, he expects, she thinks that's a great fate to call down on yourself, because you get to exist so much more that way, and it's okay if a lot of those places are on fire. But it's one more way that it's incredibly, incredibly suspicious that he met her.
That had also occurred to her. She in fact concluded that if this means lots of people make lots and lots of Carissae to enslave or torture or whatever, because this is more ethical than doing it to other people, then this is an enormous win. All of their universes will have Carissa Sevar. After realizing this, she explicitly said aloud to the powers that be, "I want you to make copies of me. You have my permission to do that, in case the powers that be happen to care." If she had the time, she'd write up a more detailed set of instructions to persons considering instantiating her. But she's busy. She'd previously thought that Nethys Snack Service, that faction, arranged for Keltham to land on her, but she now thinks this can't be correct because that would constitute a threat by proxy. Keltham is more prepared to shred himself and become a god and try to blow up the universe because he landed on Cheliax and they fucked with him. If they got to pick Keltham's landing spot, they should have picked a landing spot that didn't look like it'd bias him towards destroying the world. So some other force chose his landing spot, and they need to know what it is because they need to know if it was making a threat. Well, she wants to know that. Keltham, presumably, wouldn't act any differently if he knew he was a threat, and Pharasma was going to ignore him. If Carissa has persuaded a lot of universes to put her in them, and is particularly popular with universes that use some rule like, you can make any people who on reflection want to be there, then maybe most Carissae are in those universes, and this universe only has people who on reflection want to be here. This would imply that Keltham shouldn't blow it up.
The pattern that seems to him obviously correct for a discussion like this one, as is also Dath Ilan's pattern for how very serious people discuss very serious matters, but it looks to him like he can derive it from principle easily enough, would involve identifying importantly different ways reality could be that matter to their morals, such that there is some hope of resolving those by observation or further argument, and then make predictions, and then run the experiment, especially if it's a cheap experiment. If a paving stone in hell wants to go on existing even there, and would rather not be isekai'd if that meant existing in fewer places, or becoming less encounterable, that is in fact a crux for him. Whether it is true about the paving stone on reflection might matter to him differently, depending on how much reflection was required, and how loudly the paving stone would yell to ignore this reflection, and please kill them, because they're hurting. In principle, they could wishnap a paving stone from hell and use detect thoughts on it and try to ask it questions and hope the paving stone is in good enough shape to have recognizable thoughts in reaction to words, if not maybe to talk. There are obstacles and costs to doing this. First, he wonders what Carissa predicts of it, whether paving stones in hell will prove to have the surprising to him property of accepting horrible futures if that's the cost of more people in reality being able to meet the paving stone.
Golarion is definitely, observably, not run on the principle that everyone in it, at every time they might be asked, wants to exist there. She has met people who don't. There are more complicated things that could be true of it that, by Carissa's values, would constitute a strong argument against destroying it. For example, if everyone looked at the distribution of outcomes in Golarion before being instantiated there and agreed to take their chances on it, even if they dislike the actual outcome they got. Or maybe they'll find a way to fix hell and find in 10,000 years everyone will agree existing now is worth the time they spent as a paving stone. The surprising, not impossible thing they could learn of paving stones is that there's actually nothing it's like to be a paving stone. That Asmodeus has hidden that because of the beneficial effects seeing the paving stones has on non-paving stones. It's on the wall, but she doesn't consider it very likely.
The other thing that could be true, but that would be hard for them to observe, is that most of reality that continues on from paving stones is worse for them than hell. He mostly expects this is not the case, but that touches on different large issues. He has not previously scried hell, asked any questions about hell's internal details more complicated than he got from his unfortunate previous vision of hell, in case his doing so would lend additional reality to the targets of his scry or inquiry. Possibly this egg has already broken, if Carissa has journeyed into hell and talked with damned souls in ways that depend on the details of their torment, or worse, looked inside their minds. Mid-Keltham would have asked her and bargained with her not to do that, if he'd seen it coming.
Carissa has ventured into hell and interacted with the devils there, though mostly not with the paving stones or the petitioners. Her past self would have required a lot to be bargained out of that. The suffering of some 10 or 100 people in the world where she causes it by visiting hell again seems much less important than them having slightly more accurate information and more resources, or Asmodeus having slightly less cause for suspicion, or where they gain whatever they gain by negotiating with Despater and Ericura.
On Carissa's mainline assumptions as he understands them, that's a valid derivation. The suffering of one paving stone is a small weight compared to all of Pharasma's creation. This is true only if everything in Pharasma's creation is as real as it seems, rather than it being almost entirely unreal, and becoming real when a viewpoint character needs to look at it. On that alternate premise, looking into the thoughts of one entity undergoing extreme suffering, whose history would then need to have been extrapolated inside the putative story-wise simulation of Golarion that they're inside, is a significant cost. They are otherwise inside a non-story-wise, non-magical simulation of magical physics. High probability, not one that Pharasma created. She is not powerful enough for that. This again touches on other large issues.
Carissa doesn't think it makes sense to care very much about harms inside the world where very few people are real, unless you are overwhelmingly confident that's the world you're in. The world with trillions of people in it is just trillions of times more important, and as a result, you should virtually always be doing things that make sense in that world. It would have to be an exceptionally unusual situation where something had trillions of times the effect in the world where most people weren't real. Extrapolating the life of one suffering person seems very bad, but not anywhere near bad enough she'd trade it against even an infinitesimal cost in the world where trillions of lives are at stake.
Depends on priors, as this is locally unobservable, for the amount of total reality, in the sense of a fraction of total realness of existence, that you think is invested in the realities across those two hypothetical cases. You can't get moral worth/utility just by comparing the numbers of real people across the twin cases. That rule would say to value tiny quantum outcomes as much as large quantum outcomes in your future, since the people count would be the same in both cases. Dathilan ran on simple physics, and had no visible story-like attributes or signs of past intervention by extra-universal beings. Finding yourself in Dathilan, or a planet similar to it, it makes sense to expect that almost all of your reality comes from the underlying mathematical structure of physics being faithfully implemented. On simplicity priors, almost all of your reality comes from worlds where the other people visible are as visible as you, and those worlds are getting a lot of realness, as a fraction of all existence that way. There's a possible Pharasma's creation, where everybody is real, and he and Carissa are only a tiny fraction of that realness. There's a possible Golarion, where he, Carissa, and the other Project Lawful researchers are the main real people. There's a possible Golarion where the viewpoint shifted off himself and Carissa when their INT went too high, and Pilar Pineda is now the viewpoint character. He is mostly at this point planning across the everyone equally real version of creation because the people there are hurting more and more in need of rescue, because he assigns majority probability to that world being the case, because there is not much he really values that he can achieve for himself selfishly now in the story like Golarion. It's not particularly clear to him that the everyone equally real universe gets a larger dollop of total reality fluid summed over all the people, across all the realities where something like that exists, compared to the story like Golarion's. Pharasma's creation has more complicated physics and is also more story-like, maybe especially in their own version. It may be that most situations like theirs exist inside generalized stories, rather than because something happens to be running physics like that and gets selected to host a story. He doesn't want to be an idiot by making a paving stone's horrible life and past much more real, in the event that story-like continua are where most of the reality fluid resides.
Story-like Galarians, where people's realness varies with how much Keltham or Carissa are paying attention to them, should be a very tiny fraction of all story-like Galarians. This is, of course, going to be very difficult to test, but Carissa thinks that the strongest argument that many Galarians run on stories is that there are a lot of extraordinary stories in Galarian, to the point where it's something people have a concept for, the meteoric ascension and/or downfall of epic heroes. It makes her envision some kind of setup where there's a baseline physics Galarian and then a lot more reality fluid in individual extraordinary stories and circumstances where more people are paying attention or playing out minor variations. For most possible creators or audience who'd make this story, most stories they would tell in Golarion would not be this story, and would instead be, say, Nex's story, or Erasni's story, or Erodin's story, or Iomedes' story, or Cyprian's story, or Tarbafon's story, or Abigail's story, or the story of many other people who've led classically story-like and compelling lives. Even if Carissa and Keltham are as appealing a story as any individual among the great names of history, which she doubts, there are thousands such. Creators would probably reuse resources across stories, so you'd expect that the default outcome of looking for a person would be their being temporarily copied from a different Golarion, which increases that person's reality fluid but not very much, because this story does not, in how many implausible events shuffled them here, seem likely to Carissa to be one that has a lot of reality fluid.
Point 0. Not directly disagreeing with anything Carissa thought, but reviewing background as he knows it, since their synchronization is recursing to this depth where it's relevant. If you compute a simulation of something using more sophisticated programming techniques than their magical simulation of magic can support, it should be easy to seamlessly simulate a universe that's computed in only as much detail in every global part as is required to attain some specified accuracy level in the local details as seen from a viewpoint. The key thing is not the commonness of simulations, but the total amounts of reality fluid in them, or in particular parts of them. If a uniformly distributed reality fluid simulation of Golarion has much more reality fluid than a variably detailed simulation, the uniform simulation will be correspondingly more expensive to simulating entities, and they'll create fewer simulations like that. The key question is not so much, are uniform simulations or locally weighted simulations more common, as how much reality fluid in total do higher entities want to invest in all uniform simulations versus all locally weighted ones. Point 1. They're coming in with different intuitive priors as to what a story should look like. Nex, Erasni, Erodin, Iomede don't look like Dathalani stories, and they don't look like an Aerolarp in particular. If Iomede's story involved isekai entities from outside creation, or multiple romantic prospects each with distinct special abilities, or asexuals who watch it all, Golarion history has omitted the fact. Nex and Geb, so far as he knows, were not obviously having a romance at all. Or, if they were having a Blackrom relationship, they didn't obviously have anthropically unshareable updates on their self-observation of isekai immortality to explain away their persistent disagreement, which is very much the sort of plot development you find in Dathalani romances and not in Golarion romances. The story of Keltham and Carissa appears to have been written for somebody with an Alani-style knowledge background, or maybe a mating of his and Carissa's mortal knowledge backgrounds. The story of Nex and Geb doesn't obviously share this feature, as might indicate optimization for transcreational artistic properties. Point 2. If he fails to destroy, modify this whole universe, it's then much more plausible that his story was only one story among many, compared to the case if he does destroy, modify this whole universe. If everything goes as he plans, he will be sort of standout among people with an impact who had important stories. Point 3. Even if Nex and Geb were relatively real, it doesn't imply the paving stones in hell are real before Carissa or some other viewpoint character casts detect thoughts on them. The high-resolution viewpoint might look only at Nex and his surroundings, especially as spread around by detect thoughts, rather than simulating everyone in equal detail. There might not exist a pre-computed high-resolution, hell-tormented paving stone that would be exactly and realistically the one that Carissa or himself would find, especially given that the two of them at INT 29 would notice anomalies in the origin date or average life of such a paving stone.
It is true that all of the stories Carissa knows of are Golarian sorts of stories, not Dathilan sorts of stories. She doesn't think that's an argument this story has more reality fluid than those stories, but it is certainly a difference in their character. She does think that if they're in a story, then probably Keltham will fail tragically and get squished, changing nothing. It's what would happen in every kind of story she's ever heard of. Actually, she thinks if they're in a story, they're in a failed timeline, which will be glimpsed by the successful Carissa and Keltham at some point. It seems like another reason to operate on the assumption things are governed by causality and not narrative satisfyingness. If things are governed by causality, they don't actually look hopeless to her. Maybe the thing Snack Service is planning will succeed.
A Dathilani story wouldn't balk at letting him or Carissa change Pharasma's creation, so yes, they're coming in with different story priors. The key question is what tropes the higher entities use. Sending somebody in from entirely outside creation into a story with tropes made of both his culture and Carissa's culture, his best guess as to why the narrative does not quite feel Dathilani, seems like the kind of event that might betoken more involvement by entities who could dispense variable reality fluid at all. That said, his current guess is that the existence of Pharasma's creation predates this present interference. Golarian does not quite look shaped by the same pattern that designed their story. That's why he's spending so much effort trying to destroy, modify this world. He's just not confident enough in that belief to risk creating, infusing with retroactive reality, a paving stone who'll be one of only 20 real people who needed minds detailed enough to pass telepathic inspection. Events here, especially after the breaking of prophecy, plausibly to him were proceeding without tropish improbability at all. That could itself be a literary artifice, the story of somebody in a tropish situation who came to a world that previously had been running on its own logic. But his own guess is that he, or rather his story, is an emissary sent to creation from outside and to some degree above. Background. Unless something even stranger is going on, there are entities at a much higher level than Pharasma, entities with INT very, very far above hers, who operate a larger continuum within which Pharasma's creation is one small bubble. Much of what seemed puzzling about Dath Ilan, he has now realized, is explained by the following key point. Anybody with a computer and a bunch of keeper-suppressed knowledge about how to construct actually efficient agents could unleash an unstoppable horror that would eat Pharasma and her fellow outer gods like so many grapes. Given that Pharasma is still around, she and her creation and the rest of the outer gods are presumably inside a zoo-like preserve laid down by higher entities, a zoo within which genuinely scary things can't exist. Dathilan doesn't have any protection like that, so they're twisted up into a weird shape so that they can research making a controllable ultra-smart thing or possibly heritage engineer smarter children to research it. He's much more confident about the Dathilan statements than any of his Golarian guesses. Dathilan is much simpler and straightforward and known to him, and at INT 29, the shape of the evidence he has about Dathilan is completely straightforward. Dathilan looks exactly like it should look, if it secretly believed that anybody with a sufficient combination of computing power and exfo hazardous knowledge could destroy Dathilan and surrounding galaxies. He has complicated guesses about why entities paying the creation-containing entities to send a story-like event into Pharasma's creation might pay to make that event story-like, or why the entities operating the level above Pharasma's creation might charge less to accept an intervention if it was story-like. But this they should probably not fully recurse on, and should do more breadth-first exploration, like if Carissa has any questions about what he just thought about Dathilan.
As a conclusion about Dathilan, it makes sense, and makes sense of her own instinct that Dathilan, for all its wealth, isn't right, isn't nice in the ways it should be nice or safe in the ways it should be safe, that it is maybe in the stage of growing up, but certainly isn't what a civilization would hope to grow up to be. One of the side notes on her wall, a line of inquiry that she didn't expect to be crucial, but that had an off chance of being so, asked, "What is the nature of gods? What is the dividing line between godhood and mere incredibly excessive power and intelligence?" There is a dividing line. No one names Nex or Tarbafon or Baba Yaga a god, even though they are plainly in many respects constrained only as the gods are constrained. They don't pick clerics. That's the answer her textbook would give. All of her speculation here was tentative. It is a matter where little is known, and the process that selected what was known isn't a trustworthy one. But her best guess had been that the gods were on the other side of a divide that she can plainly see looming ahead of her now. If you are a sufficiently muddled sort of mind, getting more intelligent changes your priorities, it is very nearly impossible for a muddled mind to deliberately get more intelligent in a way that doesn't have that effect. It was part of the problem she was trying to solve, for Aspexia Rugaton, when she was an Asmodean, and look how well that went. Under most circumstances, then, a mind that cares about its current values shouldn't consent to a procedure that changes the mind and predictably changes the values. She predicts if she asked Aspexia Rugaton if she wanted all her stats wished up by 5, Aspexia'd in fact be at least somewhat reluctant. So until you have figured out how to change yourself while preserving what you care about, there is a large class of possible self-modifications that would be obvious, unambiguous good ideas if you knew how to stably preserve yourself through them, and that are equally obviously a terrible idea if you don't. A mind that figured out that thing would make all of those changes, go into the place in the space of all possible minds that collection of modifications takes you towards. A mind that hasn't figured out that thing is going to be stuck, unable to verify its own integrity across various modifications.
It's not that hard for a coherent mind to preserve its own preferences through self-modification, unless he's missed something. It might have taken him a while to work out the math at INT 18, and if he was starting from Galarian's math background instead of Dathilan's, it might have seemed like a huge deal. But at INT 29, the logical structure for an unbounded, already coherent agent amplifying while staying coherent looks straightforward. Here it is. It doesn't fully solve the problem for Carissa, because she's not already a coherent agent nor unbounded. But knowing it may help in practice too, much like knowing the formal law of inverse probability can help in informally weighing evidence. When you're not a coherent agent, when the decisions you'd make at different times and in different states of mind step on each other's toes and defeat each other, any choice you make to become something else which is not that means that you will act differently, under some circumstances, than you would have before. It's in this sense that for an incoherent thing to become coherent must seem, from its own perspective, like reshaping itself to do unnatural things, at least sometimes. But that only happens when the natural behavior is in some way stepping on itself. Otherwise, you could act the same way as a greater intelligence. Indeed, you could just do similarly as a greater intelligence in a few special places, so long as you weren't doing it all the time, or in a way that burned all of your resources. It's strange to imagine that obstacle blocking Nex from becoming a god, that Nex couldn't see any trustworthy pathway to further improve his own intelligence and stay Nex, even with decades to work on it, that Nex turned back from that possibility and feared it. Still, he supposes he can imagine it being possible for a very smart Galarian native to get stuck on the problem. However, another plausible barrier is Nex's concern about being squished by a Chikek, while prophecy was still running. That Nex was powerful might be exactly why the ancient gods wouldn't assent to Nex taking divinity, and Nex could have known that. He expects he'll have to become a god in order to rig Pharasma's creation for destruction. He has already reshaped himself in somewhat of the way that past Carissa saw and worried about. He has begun readying himself for imminent godhood, giving himself a shape that can be stable, not fighting against itself. He has crystallized his mind into something that knows itself in detail and operates itself in detail, that has designated internal resolutions to its internal conflicts. His conflicting desires have been reified into something closer to a utility function, with multiple subfunctions attaching simply summable opposed weights in place of internal conflict. It's one of several ways in which he's prioritized doing something about creation over being faithful to the original pattern of Keltham or humanity. The more he starts with a coherent utility function, he suspects, the more he'll get to keep that coherent utility function when he ascends, instead of the Starstone choosing a utility function for him in the process of granting him divinity and divine domains. He is worried that becoming a god is an unnatural form of enhancement that imposes extra constraints.
Carissa is pretty sure that all the parts of her which aren't people shouldn't all be murdered have in fact been incoherent across self-modification. Not because she can't see in principle how an agent could be coherent, but because she in fact isn't. She thinks there's a way to incorporate this insight into Severism, but isn't necessarily going to straighten out the rest of it because, in fact, people shouldn't all be murdered is enough to be getting on with for most of her purposes. Maybe she'll spend 5 minutes on it later, see if it's simpler than it looks from here. Backtracking to the previous topic, if she's not misunderstanding him, Keltham was hypothesizing that there's something strange about the fact godhood is a well on the other side of that line, instead of entities with the ability to modify and improve themselves, continuing to do so and use their improvements to amass more resources to use for more improvements. She doesn't think that theory requires some higher entities above Pharasma and her ilk. They can just themselves be competent to squish baby things that will grow up to eat them, and in fact, Odelmans and entities like her seem to have precisely that remit and fairly extraordinary powers to deploy in pursuing it. Numeria is in a bubble, after all.
Cached thoughts adapted from Dathilan's analysis of the Great Silence, absence of visible aliens in Dathilan. Given the existence of FTL travel via interplanetary teleport and the absence of much of a visible local speed limit, if it's possible to become something bigger that can tear through Pharasma and absorb the resources of her creation, and that happens anywhere in the larger playground that embeds creation and has outer gods elsewhere inside it, Pharasma and all the other outer gods would quickly fall. Pharasma is still here, so possibility 1, some higher force protects her. Near equivalently, some entity wrote the complicated laws of their higher creation, such that it wasn't possible for anything inside to become dangerous. Possibility 2. Pharasma or at least one outer god holds sway over every part of the larger universe that embeds creation. They have uniformly agreed not to become any more dangerous than each other. They uniformly squish everything within the larger universe that tries to become more dangerous before it can actually get powerful. 2's premise of uniform cooperation doesn't well match what surface appearances he has been able to gather about outer gods. The outer gods don't seem to be running in a state of careful uniform cooperative action with Pharasma. Rovagug required action from Pharasma to suppress, and would probably become a bigger, scarier, more dangerous thing if it could do that. He suspects, based on his early research attempts into outer stuff, that there's some sort of outer thing sealed beneath Cheliax's Whisperwood. He was thinking of unsealing that, at some point, for additional observations/experiments to bear on open questions in this vicinity.
Carissa suspects that's the kind of action that causes Odelmans to look at you more carefully and then immediately squish you. It's actually slightly surprising to Carissa that this has not happened already.
Multiple hypotheses there, primarily that ancient gods in general, and possibly Odelmans in particular, have a lot of trouble decoding mind states of embodied mortals, as would be trivial to an actually scary thing. To surface appearances, absent complicated immersive divine deceptions, Galarian is a world where outer cultists and Rovagug cultists can exist and gain cleric powers, and this was true even before prophecy was shattered. This implies weird things in general about to what degree the ancient gods, Pharasma-aligned entities, can see well and intervene cheaply. His current precautions include mind blank as much of the time as he can manage, and having negotiated with Odelmans via Rilatha about Doombase screening if he agreed to return to the Ostenso region. He'd try to make the Outer Things release look like an unrelated accident that he was responding to helpfully, at least so far as surface glances of gods could tell about the surrounding situation.
Carissa's theory of why there are Rovagug cultists is that they don't matter to the gods, and the cultists mostly rederive it independently, so stamping them out wouldn't keep them gone. Though it's definitely also the case that the gods have a hard time interpreting mortal minds and have a hard time in general seeing what's going on now that prophecy is broken. Osirion, of course, has a prediction market on the odds he's trying to let Rovagug out, and the gods can see that. His primary advantage is that he's a First Circle wizard, and everyone knows First Circle wizards who want to destroy the world can't actually do it. The first time he demonstrates any genuinely unprecedented capabilities, he loses that. What specifically would he be trying to learn from unleashing an outer thing, and can they just ask it of Arakura?
Foremost, he wants to try communicating, like by tapping out sequences of primes and so on. They're standard Dath Ilani ideas about how to open communications with aliens, which plausibly nobody in Galarian would have tried with Outer Things after tongues failed to work. If he can establish communications, an Outer Thing might know all kinds of relevant stuff that Pharasma-aligned entities don't want to tell them. Failing that, if he at INT-29, WIS-27, and with his greater background knowledge of alien possibilities via Dath Ilani extrapolation, is still as horrified by the Outer Thing as other observers report being horrified by Outer Things, maybe he'd update further about Pharasma being a relatively nice medium-sized entity who ought to be kept around despite the hell business.
That's a pretty tantalizing possibility, though obviously he doesn't expect to update in that fashion, or they could skip the step with unleashing any Outer Things. She doesn't actually see why he doesn't believe already that Pharasma is a relatively nice medium-sized entity. She believes that.
Nice by his definition of nice. His thoughts attempt to shut down several distracting, non-optimally conversation-steering side thoughts about Hell's tolerability, and Carissa's earlier thought that Karasan lawful good societies would keep slaves.
Carissa thinks that, well, mostly people go to Hell because of the awful things they do to other, weaker, worse-off people, and that really does look like human values, or something like them, were a substantial input into the afterlife system. Not the only input, but human values probably have something like 90% overlap with the actual system. Most people think it's right, and just that bad people go to Hell. Carissa doesn't especially agree with them, but the thing Pharasma is doing is recognizably in most of its details in the space of things humans might do, and you wouldn't necessarily expect that from things done by a bizarre and distant alien. Keltham has perhaps by now read about how war is practiced between nations in Galarian, though he won't have seen it firsthand. Armies march through farmland claimed by the enemy faction, killing everyone who resists, taking all their food and leaving those they do not kill to starve, raping women, taking slaves, slaughtering children. Ordinary people are called up to serve in those armies. Ordinary people do those acts because they can, because everyone else is doing it. That's not what Chelish armies do because someone engineered Cheliax that way. That's what ordinary Taldane or Kadiran armies do in the ordinary course of war. The worst half of those soldiers will go to Hell. And while Carissa thinks that Hell should make better use of them, she does think that the assessment that they are lawful evil is basically correct, and Axis is reasonable in not wanting to let them in, and a Hell which was merely a place full of people like them would be awful. By some estimates she dug up while she was doing research for her wall, 1 in 10 people is a slave owner. It's higher in Cheliax, of course, which wants everyone to be a slave owner to damn them, but across history the best estimate is that it's 1 in 10. Not all of those go to Hell, but they sure do go away towards explaining why about 1 in 10 people go to Hell. Carissa's family owns slaves. The staff at the villa the first few days, before Odelmans picked broom and they realized it was a vulnerability, were all slaves, if Keltham hadn't figured that out. The fire elementals who heat the water are slaves. They didn't realize right away that they should hide from Keltham things, like how people enjoy gladiatorial contests and public executions, because that's true in Taldor too. That is, to her, the fundamental expression of who Pharasma is and what Pharasma wants. People go to an afterlife that reflects the choices they made in life, and that afterlife is good or bad depending on whether the choices they made in life were conducive to good worlds or bad ones. You can disagree with that, of course, but nothing about it feels especially inhuman. In Ilani, maybe, but not inhuman.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.